Imagine it's 1958. You wake up at 6 in the morning in a modest apartment in a city like New York or Chicago. The window is frosted on the inside, not because you forgot to close it, because you couldn't afford a better building. The heat comes from an aging gas stove, and the walls are thin enough that you can hear your neighbor's alarm clock go off 3 minutes before yours. You are 31 years old. You have 2 children asleep in the next room. You have a job as a filing clerk downtown. And 6 months ago, after years of a marriage that had quietly become unbearable, you became something that would follow you like a shadow for the rest of your life in this era. You became a divorced woman. Now, before you picture anything resembling freedom, before you picture a fresh start, a new apartment, a sense of relief, understand this. The system you are waking up inside of in 1958 was not designed to help you survive. It was designed to make sure you never left in the first place. The divorce rate in the United States in 1958 had just hit its lowest point of the entire 20th century. For decades, historians and nostalgists have looked at that number and called the 1950s an era of stable, happy families. But that interpretation has it exactly backwards. The marriages weren't lasting because they were happy. They were lasting because the exit was practically sealed shut. Legally, financially, and socially, leaving a marriage in 1958 meant stepping off a cliff. And for the women who did take that step, through courage, desperation, or simply survival instinct, what awaited them on the other side was a world that had been methodically constructed to make sure they could not function without a man. This is what that world actually looked like from the inside. You get up before your children. That's the rule. There is no flexibility in this. Society, your workplace, your neighbors, and your own interior voice, trained by decades of magazine columns and church sermons, all agree on one thing. You must never let your circumstances show on your face. So before the kids are awake, you set your hair. You apply your face cream. You do your makeup with the precision of someone who understands that her respectability is measured, in part, by how put together she appears despite everything she is carrying. This isn't vanity, it's armor. You prepare breakfast, hot cereal, toast, maybe eggs if you had time to shop yesterday. You pack the children's lunches. You get them dressed. You sweep the linoleum floor, make the beds, air the rooms. Then you are out the door and racing toward a bus stop because you cannot, under any circumstances, be late. You don't have a new car. You cannot get a loan for a new car. Not in your own name. Not without a male co-signer, a father, a brother, or, absurdly, the very ex-husband you just escaped. So you drive a used vehicle that rattles and occasionally refuses to start. Or you take the bus, hoping it runs on time. Either way, the morning is already a small act of survival, before you've even sat down at your desk. At the office, you are a secretary or a filing clerk. You are good at your job. You may well be better at it than the man sitting in the office down the hall who earns nearly twice your salary. But the pay gap you're experiencing isn't just a disparity. It is formal, institutionalized policy. The labor market of 1958 is built on something called the family wage doctrine, the idea that men need to be paid enough to support an entire household, while women only work for pin money, discretionary income, spending money. The assumption built into every paycheck you receive is that you don't really need it, that someone else is handling the important expenses, that you are, economically speaking, a hobby, except you aren't. You are the only income in your household, and your salary, roughly $2,600 a year as a secretary, the equivalent of about $30,000 today, has to cover rent, groceries, children's clothing, utilities, and every unexpected crisis that a life with 2 small children inevitably produces. The math does not work. It is designed not to work. At lunchtime, you eat at your desk, not because you prefer it, because restaurants present their own complications. Upscale dining rooms in 1958 routinely refused to seat unaccompanied women, operating under the assumption that a woman dining alone or with a female friend must be, as the polite language of the era put it, no better than she should be. The rules of public space in 1958 are written for men, enforced against women, and invisible to everyone who doesn't have to navigate them. When you leave work at 5 o'clock, your second shift begins immediately. Because most urban apartments of the era don't have large, modern refrigerators with full freezers. And because you can't afford to buy in bulk, you shop for food almost every day. You walk to the butcher for ground beef at 33 cents a pound. You stop at the greengrocer for a head of iceberg lettuce at 19 cents, some broccoli for 23. You carry everything home in paper bags or a wire pull trolley, counting every penny, mentally running calculations that most people around you don't have to make. Back in the apartment, you change out of your work clothes immediately. You cannot afford to wear them out. You put on a house dress, start dinner, meatloaf, a casserole of noodles, and canned cream of mushroom soup, and begin the second half of a day that started at 6 in the morning. Then comes the ironing. This detail stops modern audiences every time, and rightly so. In 1958, synthetic permanent press fabrics essentially do not exist. Everything in your home, every cotton dress, every school uniform, every pair of denim jeans, every bedsheet, every pillowcase, wrinkles after washing. And wrinkled clothing in 1958 is not a casual fashion choice. It is a social signal. It tells your neighbors, your employer, your children's teachers, and every stranger on the street that you are a woman in chaos, a woman who has lost control of her household and, by extension, herself. So you iron. 2, sometimes 3 hours every evening, working through a pile of laundry while the radio plays in the background. You iron the bed sheets. You iron the jeans. You iron the tablecloth. And then you fall into bed knowing that tomorrow starts at 6 again. This was not the exception. This was Tuesday. But the physical exhaustion was only one dimension of this life. The social dimension was something else entirely. In 1958, the United States is in the grip of what historians would later call domestic containment. The Cold War has transformed the American family into a geopolitical symbol. Government propaganda contrasts the supposedly liberated American housewife, cheerful, fashionable, tending to her gleaming suburban kitchen, with the grim portrait of Soviet women depicted in gunny sacks, laboring in state factories while their children are raised by the communist state. The subtext of this propaganda is not subtle. The American family is the front line of the war against communism. A stable marriage is a patriotic act. A broken one is something dangerously close to a national security threat, which means a divorced woman is not simply a woman who ended a marriage. She is, in the cultural logic of 1958, evidence that something has gone wrong, something weak, something suspect. Advice columns in Ladies' Home Journal instruct women that keeping their husbands happy is their primary civic duty. Marriage counselors ask women whose husbands have become abusive what they may have done to provoke the behavior, or whether they have made sufficient effort to remain physically appealing at home. When a marriage fails, the cultural consensus is nearly unanimous. The wife failed. She failed to keep her man. Your neighbors know you are divorced, and while most of them won't say it to your face, you can feel the subtle recalibration in how they treat you. The married women in your building are pleasant enough, but there is a wariness there, as though divorce were somehow transmissible. The men in your office treat your unmarried status as an open invitation, mistaking the absence of a husband for the absence of standards. You learn quickly to navigate a world full of men who believe that because you are experienced, you have forfeited the right to say no. Dating, if you ever risk it, has to be conducted in almost total secrecy. Because in 1958, if your ex-husband or an unfriendly neighbor can produce evidence that you are seeing someone, that an unrelated man has been observed entering your home, a family court judge can declare you an unfit mother and take your children, not metaphorically, literally. The custody you were awarded can be revoked on the grounds of moral conduct, which in 1958 means a woman's romantic life is a permanent legal vulnerability. You keep the curtains drawn. You answer questions about your personal life with careful vagueness. You live, in some important ways, like a person with something to hide, even though the only thing you are hiding is the ordinary human desire to not be completely alone. Now let's talk about the financial cage, because this is where the story of 1958 becomes genuinely staggering to modern eyes. Until 1974, 16 years after the moment we're describing, it was completely legal in the United States for a bank to refuse a woman a credit card, a loan, or even a bank account in her own name without a male co-signer. Not a policy suggestion. The law. If you walked into a bank in 1958 and asked for a credit card, the loan officer would tell you to come back with your father, your brother, or your ex-husband, the man you just divorced, the man you left. His signature was required to validate your financial existence. It gets worse. If you wanted to buy a home, if you had somehow, through years of careful saving, accumulated enough for a down payment, mortgage lenders were legally permitted to discount your income by 50 to 100% during underwriting. Their reasoning was straightforward and openly stated. Single women of childbearing age would inevitably get pregnant, quit their jobs, and stop making payments. Therefore, your salary simply didn't count. One more detail that tends to land hard with modern audiences. Loan officers in 1958 routinely questioned female applicants about their birth control practices before approving a loan, not as a private curiosity, as a formal underwriting procedure. Your reproductive choices were treated as a creditworthiness metric. Without access to credit, you cannot buy a home. Without the ability to buy, you rent. And the rental market of 1958 has its own rules for women like you. Before the Fair Housing Act was amended in 1974, landlords could legally charge divorced women higher monthly rent than they charged men for the identical apartment. The justification was that single women lacked a male protector to guarantee payment. They were, in the language of the era, higher-risk tenants. Many apartment buildings also maintained strict no-children policies. This wasn't unusual. This wasn't a scandal. It was simply how the housing market worked, pushing divorced mothers with children into older, less desirable buildings in neighborhoods they hadn't chosen. And if you were poor enough to qualify for state assistance, AFDC, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, the government itself became a new and specifically terrifying presence in your life. Under the man-in-the-house rules, any evidence that a male was physically present in your home was treated as welfare fraud. The logic was that if a man was there, he should be supporting the family, which meant the state had no obligation to do so. To enforce this, welfare caseworkers conducted what became known as midnight raids. Without warrants, without notice. Officers would knock on apartment doors or simply enter in the middle of the night and search the premises for any sign of male occupation. A second toothbrush, a pair of men's socks in a drawer, a package of cigarettes in a brand associated with men, mail addressed to a male name. Any of these things found during a midnight inspection was sufficient to immediately terminate your benefits and evict you from public housing. These raids were not rare. They were policy, and they fell with particular ferocity on poor Black, divorced, and single mothers, destroying not only their financial stability, but their basic constitutional right to privacy in their own homes. The America of 1958 for these women was not a gleaming chrome and optimism postcard. It was a surveillance state wearing a house dress. But here is something the standard historical narrative tends to miss. Even getting a divorce in 1958 was its own extraordinary obstacle course. The concept of no-fault divorce, the idea that two people can simply agree that a marriage has ended without either party being legally culpable, did not exist anywhere in the United States in 1958. The American Bar Association had begun working on reform legislation as early as 1950, but the first no-fault divorce law wouldn't pass until California in 1969. That's 11 years away from where we're standing. In 1958, if you want a divorce, you have to prove someone committed a crime. The acceptable grounds varied by state, but typically included adultery, physical cruelty, desertion, and in some states, habitual drunkenness, simply growing apart, falling out of love, becoming incompatible, or living in quiet misery. None of these qualified. In 2/3 of American states, all property acquired during a marriage was under the unilateral legal control of the husband. You could have worked for 20 years and built a household together, and upon divorce, the legal presumption favored him. And then there was New York. New York State in 1958 maintained the strictest divorce law in the nation, unchanged in its essential structure since 1787. In New York, the only legal ground for divorce was proven adultery, not cruelty, not abandonment, adultery, and not just alleged adultery. Photographically documented adultery, with witnesses. This had given rise to something remarkable, an entire underground industry operating in plain sight, largely tolerated by judges and lawyers who understood perfectly well what was happening, built around the manufacture of fake evidence. Here is how it worked. A couple who mutually wanted to end their marriage, who had perhaps been unhappy for years, who had perhaps tried counseling, who had perhaps simply and quietly stopped being a couple in any meaningful sense, would approach a divorce lawyer. The lawyer would explain the options. Then the lawyer would make a phone call. He would book a hotel room. He would hire a photographer, and he would retain the services of what the court records of the era referred to, with deliberate vagueness, as an unknown blonde. The husband would go to the hotel with the hired woman. They would remove most of their clothing and wait on the bed. The husband would tip the front desk clerk to send a maid up to tidy the room in exactly 10 minutes. When the maid knocked and entered, the husband and the hired woman would arrange themselves in a convincingly compromising position. The photographer, waiting in the corridor, would burst in immediately behind the maid. Flash photographs were taken. The maid, flustered and unwilling, became an unwitting witness. Those photographs, along with the maid's testimony and the photographer's statement, would be presented to a New York judge as proof of adultery, and the divorce would be granted. The hired woman had to be careful about one thing. She could never allow her face to be captured in the photographs, which is why the court records describe her the way they do. She contorted herself during the flash to remain faceless. She was legally a stranger. She was the unknown blonde. One woman, Dorothy Jarvis, testified in 1934 that she had participated in this procedure over 100 times. For a fee of $50 to $100 per staging, roughly $500 to $1,100 in today's money. These professional hired women serviced a steady weekly demand from the courts of New York City. If a New York court found the husband guilty of adultery through this process, there was an additional consequence so severe it's almost hard to believe. He was legally banned from ever marrying again within the state of New York for the rest of his first wife's natural life. Some men fled to other states to remarry. Others simply lived in legal limbo. The law, designed to punish adultery, ended up punishing the manufactured performance of it. For the wealthy, there was always another option. 600 miles away in the Nevada desert, a city had built its entire economy on a single, elegant legal loophole. Reno, Nevada, the divorce capital of the world. Nevada had discovered something that other states hadn't, that there was serious money to be made by legislating what other places forbade. Nevada had already legalized gambling. It had maintained lenient marriage laws, and in the early 20th century, it had lowered its divorce residency requirement to just 6 weeks, the shortest in the nation, and had established broadly permissible grounds that included simple incompatibility. 6 weeks in Nevada, and you could walk away from a marriage that New York would have kept you trapped in for decades. The wealthy came in waves: socialites, Hollywood actresses, society wives whose names appeared in gossip columns and whose arrivals at Reno train stations were covered like celebrity events. For those who could afford it, the 6 weeks were spent at exclusive divorce ranches, places like the Flying M.E. in Washoe Valley. riding horses by day, drinking bourbon and playing the tables by night, waited on by rugged ranch hands called dude wranglers, breathing desert air and waiting for legal freedom to be processed like an order at a restaurant. But for working-class women who arrived in Reno with nothing, the reality was less cinematic. They had to take jobs, waitressing, card dealing, laundry work, just to cover room and board during the 6-week waiting period. They lived in boarding houses on streets like Ralston Street, sharing communal telephones, sitting on porch swings in the evenings with other women doing the same calculation. How many more days until I can go home free? And there is one more Reno detail worth knowing. One of the most iconic images of the era, a newly divorced woman hurling her wedding ring off the Virginia Street Bridge into the Truckee River below, reclaiming her freedom in a single dramatic gesture. Turns out to be almost entirely fiction. When the city cleaned the river beneath the bridge in September of 1950, salvage divers recovered exactly one wedding ring. One. The legendary Bridge of Sighs ritual that appeared in postcards, tourist brochures, and eventually in films like Marilyn Monroe's The Misfits was a marketing invention, a piece of mid-century manufactured mythology. A British actress named Margot Graham had staged a ring toss for a photographer in 1936, using a cheap ring purchased from a discount store. The image spread. The story became legend. The river contained almost nothing. The liberation was, like so much of what 1958 promised women, largely an advertisement. And yet there were corners of this world where something genuinely different was being built, quietly, in living rooms and kitchens across suburban America. In the mid-1950s, a divorced single mother named Brownie Wise was trying to figure out how to pay her young son's medical bills. She had no access to conventional credit. She had no male sponsor. She had no connections in the corporate world that would have allowed a woman of her era and circumstances to rise in a traditional business setting. What she had was a product she believed in, a set of polyethylene plastic containers with a novel airtight seal, and an idea about how to sell it, not through stores, through parties. Home parties hosted by women, attended by women, organized and run entirely by women. The Tupperware party was born. What Brownie Wise understood, intuitively, brilliantly, was that she was solving multiple problems at once. The obvious one was sales, but the deeper ones were social. In 1958, there were almost no respectable, socially acceptable spaces where divorced or financially struggling women could gather, build relationships, share information, and earn real money outside the scrutiny of men and the judgment of conservative community institutions. The Tupperware party was all of those things. It was a business meeting disguised as a social occasion. It was a support network operating under the cover of domesticity. It was income, real income, not pin money, earned through skill, effort, and the simple radical act of women trusting other women. Wise became the first woman ever featured on the cover of Business Week magazine. Then, in 1958, the very year we're examining, Earl Tupper fired her, abruptly, without severance, without acknowledgement of what she had built. He held all the patents. He held all the corporate power. He didn't like her public profile. So she was gone. The woman who had built the empire walked away from it with almost nothing. In a single executive decision, the story of Brownie Wise became a nearly perfect parable for the era it belonged to. Talent recognized, exploited, and then discarded the moment it became inconvenient to the man who owned the paperwork. There is something modern audiences consistently misread about 1958. We look at the low divorce rate, and we see evidence of happier marriages. We look at the bustling suburban streets and the chrome-laden cars and the television sets tuned to programs with studio audiences laughing on cue. And we see a simpler time. What we are actually seeing is containment. Countless women remained in marriages that were cold or painful or dangerous, not because they wanted to, but because every institution available to them, the courts, the banks, the landlords, the welfare system, the churches, the advice columns, the employment market, had constructed walls on every side. The legal grounds for divorce were nearly impossible to meet. The financial independence required to survive a divorce was legally blocked. The social consequences were designed to be devastating. The state itself, in the form of midnight raids and man-in-the-house surveillance, made even the aftermath of a failed escape feel like occupation. The woman who managed to navigate all of that, who found her footing in a rented apartment that cost her too much, who fed her children on a salary designed to be insufficient, who ironed the bed sheets at 10 o'clock at night and got up at 6 in the morning to do it all again, who kept her hair set and her stockings mended because appearing otherwise was a social liability she couldn't afford. That woman was not a victim of nostalgia. She was a survivor of a system. And what she was surviving, to be precise, wasn't simply hardship or social disapproval. She was surviving the deliberate institutional belief that female independence was a problem to be solved. The world has changed enormously since 1958. No-fault divorce arrived. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed in 1974. The Fair Housing Act was amended. Women gained access to credit, to mortgages, to professional careers, to legal systems that no longer required them to perform fake adultery to be free. But understanding where those rights came from, understanding the specific documented reality of what life looked like before them, matters. Not to idealize the past or catastrophize it, but to understand what it actually cost to get from there to here, and to remember the women who paid it.